So today we're going to be looking at Gamo's two current triggers that they use. They have the smooth action trigger and the custom action trigger. One is the more budget model. It's on guns like this. This is a Swarm Whisper. The other one, the custom action trigger, is on their higher end guns like the Magnum and some of their PCPs. However, if you look at them, the housing is identical. The side plates that keep everything in is identical. A lot of the bushings, screws, and whatnot are pretty much identical. Some of the little internal bits up top are a little bit different, but the actual triggers themselves, here's a smooth action trigger. Don't mind the grease all over that because we just opened this up for the first time. Just giving you a good look of it. You've got a trigger blade, your safety, your secondary sear, your primary sear, little tiny spring in there, your main spring, and this little guy right there. And if you look over here, it's almost identical. There's a few differences. Number one, the biggest one being trigger blade is different. It's got better geometry, and it's also got this little set screw down in there in that hole for adjustment, and that pokes up right there. And then the other one being the main spring is shaped slightly different, and whereas on the smooth action trigger, kind of just sits on top of your secondary sear like that. On the custom action trigger, it kind of plugs into a hole inside of the secondary sear. So in terms of actual differences, when you're pulling, when you're actually using the trigger, there's a noticeable difference. It's mostly because of the geometry of the trigger blade. Just gives you a more distinct first and second stage, as well as being able to adjust it. You can actually get it to be pretty decent. Not great, but definitely better than this. That being said, because they are identical, you can tune this, you can polish it, deburr it, time it, do all sorts of fancy stuff, which I'm doing today, to get it to be very, very close to performance on par with the custom action trigger. So that's just a brief breakdown of what you can expect going into these two triggers. Okay, so now we have the triggers completely disassembled. Every pair of parts is side by side. Everything on the right is from the custom action trigger. Everything on the left is from the smooth action trigger. And this is basically just to show you the differences. So we're going to start with the top sears. They are virtually identical, but the custom action trigger has a sear that's just slightly longer, and all that's for is just to match the geometry of the piston. The Magnum has a significantly larger piston, obviously, and it needs a lot more material on the locking surface, so it's not really going to make a difference in your pull. Nothing that you can feel anyway, but that is a difference to note. Next up, the safeties are identical. The secondary sear, you see that little hole for the custom action trigger, and then you also see the actual pivot point where it goes onto the pin. These pins right here. Custom action trigger is significantly cleaner and better machined. These little guys are virtually identical. The custom action trigger blade uses a different kind of spring. It uses a coil spring, whereas this the smooth action trigger uses that kind of spring. And you can see that this little pin here is connected to the set screw that you can adjust, and that changes where your first stage ends and your second stage begins. So messing around with that is something that's really important to be able to do to get a good clean trigger pull that you just can't do on the smooth action trigger. Additionally, the custom action trigger uses a metal, I believe it's probably aluminum because it's still very light, blade, whereas the smooth action trigger uses a plastic one. The custom action trigger has a significantly flatter and broader face, although I must say I am somewhat impressed that there is somewhat of a flat surface on the smooth action trigger, which is greatly appreciated. Over here, one thing I forgot to add, so obviously these housings are identical, but both triggers do have this little screw here, which changes your pull length. I believe that will change your first stage pull the most, but if you completely get rid of your first stage, that can kind of mess with your second stage as well. So that's something to note. And yeah, so those are the differences between these. Oh, one last thing I forgot is these springs have a slightly different geometry. The custom action trigger is just designed to sit in that hole rather than on top of the secondary sear. Okay, so finally we're going to be talking about the steps to take to polish these. I'm not going to be going over how to polish conceptually. It's sandpaper or compound, whichever you prefer. I haven't found a good polishing compound that I like so far, so I've just been using sandpaper, and I typically on triggers go up to around 2000 grit. Obviously wet dry sanding, but here are the surfaces to polish and deburr. So first off, I like to go top down. The first surface is this little nub sticking up the back side of that over towards the right of what you can see. I usually like to flatten that with a file and then polish it. That's your most important one. That will eat up a lot of dwell time if you can get that really smooth. You might even want to just barely knock a little bit of material off the top just to decrease your dwell time. Not enough where it will make the gun unsafe, but that is a very important one. Next up is the bottom of this surface, this flat, not the shelf sticking out. That's not as important. I still like to do that, but it's mostly the flat part on the bottom here, because that is where your primary sear engages your secondary sear. And so that is another big factor for reducing dwell time and making your pull more predictable. Yeah, that's the big thing that will do, is increase the predictability of your pull. So those are the two surfaces. If you do it with a compound, if you sand with a compound, you can also get inside here. It's virtually impossible to do that with sandpaper. It's not as big of a deal, to be honest with you, as the actual engagement surfaces. So that is the primary or top sear. On the secondary sear, the surfaces you're going to want to worry the most about is this rounded upper portion. That is where it engages the primary sear. So it basically just sits like that. So where those two touch, that's where you're going to want to sand and polish the most. And then you are also going to want to polish this whole flat end, just to be safe, because that's where it's touching the trigger blade. It's not as big of a deal, but it's very easy just because of how flat it is. As well as this little notch where the spring sits. If you're doing a custom action trigger, you don't need to worry about that notch because the spring's not sitting in there. So that's where you want to worry about polishing the most. You can also, because when the trigger is fired, these sears are like this. You can also polish that little surface in the middle there just to help with your reset a little bit. You'll never notice the difference, but it's something you can do. And then deburring the trigger blades. The back of that trigger blade, you can see there's a bunch of tiny little bumps and stuff. Just with some probably 400 grit sandpaper, just go back and forth and knock those off real quick. It is plastic, so don't take off too much material. On the custom action trigger, you really don't need to worry about it, but if you really want to, you can hit the top of that pin there. It's not going to make a difference, but if you like to be thorough, then go ahead and do it.